Hi, and welcome back to the AP Music Theory Crash Course series. Today we're going to be going more into detail for harmonic composition, or principles of voice leading for four voices following the various guidelines for figured bass as per the composition and free response question portion of the AP exam. So let's get started. So for harmonic composition, first we want to understand what counterpoint is, which basically it's just the relationship between two lines, the bass, which is going to be given, and the melody composed by you. So for part writing rules, this applies to free response questions 5, 6, and 7, and there are a whole bunch of these, so make sure you remember them. Firstly, of course, this is pretty basic, but stem direction for each of the four parts. We all know that there is soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, but the stem of the note goes up for only soprano and tenor, while the stem faces down for alto and bass. That's a pretty basic concept, so you don't want to mess that up and lose points. Contrapuntal character is the linear movement implied by chords in figured bass. It's basically just how each line, for instance, the soprano or the alto, how it moves. The bass is usually disjunct, meaning it moves in steps and leaps. It doesn't hit every single note, it skips one, while the alto and the tenor move very little in contrast, and the soprano is always the melody. Just a note here, but the opposite of disjunct would be conjunct, meaning it moves in consecutive notes. It hits every half or whole step. So motion is the direction of the melody in relation to the bass line. Contrary motion is when the melody moves in the opposite direction of the bass. For instance, if the bass moves downward in terms of pitch, and the melody moves upward, remember the soprano is the melody, so that's all you have to look at. If it's moving in opposite directions, then you know that's contrary motion. This is actually used very often, and it's highly recommended that you take this into consideration for free response question number 7. Oblique motion is when one voice remains on the same note and the other moves. Similar motion is when the bass and the soprano both move in the same direction, but with different intervals. Parallel motion is sort of similar. It's when both the bass and the soprano move in the same direction, but this time the intervals are the same. So there are many things that you want to avoid when you're composing for the free response questions. First of all, you never want to write parallel fifths and parallel octaves between any voices. The voices don't have to be right next to each other. Like for instance, even with bass and alto, you don't want parallel fifths and octaves. That basically just means that in two consecutive chords, you shouldn't be having the same note, just like the same number of octaves higher for two voices. It's fairly obvious if it were to be played, but since you can't play it when you're composing, you want to run through it in your head and just look at it very carefully to make sure you don't have any parallel fifths and octaves on there. That's something that many people lose points on, so be sure to check your work and avoid that. Note that unequal fifths are also undesirable. In the common practice era, you should never have a diminished fifth to a perfect fifth, although the reverse is actually acceptable. Perfect fifth to diminished fifth is fine, but diminished fifth to perfect fifth is not. You also never want to cross voices by writing a higher part lower than a lower part. For instance, you wouldn't want to write the soprano lower than the alto. Similarly, you don't want to cross the tenor with the alto or with the bass. You should also never write the upper three voices, tenor, alto, and soprano, with a distance of more than an octave between each other. So for instance, you don't want an interval of a tenth between the alto and the soprano. However, notice how the bass is not included. You can have the bass as far away as is convenient from the tenor if that's how you're writing it. You also never want to double tendency tones, particularly the leading tone, and you also don't want to double the seventh of a chord, for instance, the 5/7 chord. Doubling priority, because you need to have 4 notes in a chord as per the 4 voices. Doubling priority goes to scale degrees 1 and 5, especially with 6/4 chords, you have to double the 5. You don't really want to double the 3 unless you're in a minor chord with like special situations, but usually just double the 1 if you can. In root position chords, you can omit the 5th, but never the 3rd or the 7th or the root. Resolution rules. This is pretty important. If you have a scale degree 7 in a chord, then the key always resolves upward to 1. And if you have a scale degree 4 of the key, it resolves downward to 3. However, the 7th of a chord, this is different. You could have a 7th with any 5/7 chord, and that's not going to be the scale degree number 7 of the key. So make sure you differentiate the two. The 7th of a chord resolves downward or holds until it can. So here's a little checklist for part writing to figured bass, which you'll see in free response question 5. First of all, you want to write out the chord stack of each bass note from the figured bass. This is going to be provided, so make sure you analyze that as soon as you get it and then write out the chord stack. Figure out their respective root positions. You want to organize it so that you can see what the root is, and then you can add the Roman numerals based on their scale degree in relation to the original key. After that, you can fill in the upper voices for each chord based on what you have already mapped out as the Roman numerals and the chord stacks. But this time you want to undo the rearranging you did to find the root position, because you want to have everything in the correct inversion that it gave you based on the Roman numerals. In writing the rest of the voices, you want to make sure to avoid large skips and leaps, because that's not really desirable. You want to have as much conjunct motion as you can. Make sure that when you're finished with that, you check your work for errors like parallel fifths and octaves. Accidentals, you never want to omit your accidentals. That is also something that you can lose a lot of points on, so be careful. And of course, range, crossing, resolving, and doubling. I know that there are a lot of rules for this. Just try your best to remember all of them, since, yeah, this is a pretty big section with a lot of points. And the next thing we're going to talk about is harmonic progression, also known as chord leading. This relates to chords within the scale where they naturally lead. This relates back to, remember how we mentioned tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, that harmonic function, that relates to this quite a lot. So firstly, circle progression. This comes a lot in MCQs as usually an answer choice. This is where the movement of chords goes by diatonic fifths. Like you'll have, for instance, a C as the root of the chord, and then an F, and then a B going down by 5 each time. An important thing to remember here that the root is not the same thing as the bass. The bass is just the lowest note in the chord regardless of inversion, whereas the root is the actual bass when it's in root position, or when each note of the chord is a third away from each other. So that's something you always want to keep in mind. Progression by thirds and seconds are kind of similar, except this time you can progress up and down by a third or a second. Inversions, they weaken the function of chords in terms of the tonic, subdominant, dominant to tonic sense, but they do have a lot of other functions. For instance, the main four passing tones. Remember how we mentioned these in the last video? That's just when you join, let's say, two chords that are a skip of one, and that passing tone just fills it in so that it sounds like do, re, mi, for example. And then we have neighbor tones. That is when you have a note that is just one note higher than the notes before and after it. Arpeggios are just splitting it up into the individual notes of the chord, and pedal is just holding the same bottom note. 6/4 chords actually have a whole lot of uses, including all of these, but you want to be careful with it because even though it's quite useful, it's also quite easy to mess up in free response question 7. So unless you know exactly what you're using it for, I would actually recommend that you avoid it somewhat. You also want to make sure to recognize the connection between the bass line and the chord symbol. That will help you greatly when you're composing. So accidentals used in figured bass. This is also a pretty important concept that comes up a lot. Mode mixtures. You have the usage of chords not found in the key that you're in, usually borrowing from some parallel major or minor. So here we have the Picardy third, which is when the third of a chord that you have, it was supposed to be minor, but then it borrows from its parallel major. Remember what parallel major means is that, for example, you have D minor and D major. They are keys that begin with the same note. Those are just parallel keys, so remember that. For Picardy thirds, remember they have accidentals, don't leave them out. An example of a Picardy third would be, for instance, you have in a G minor chord, the middle, the B here, instead of a B flat, you have a B natural. That would be an instance of a Picardy third. Now, secondary dominants, these are also really prevalent in your free response questions. You usually see them notated as a Roman numeral / another Roman numeral, which just means that you're taking the first Roman numeral as your temporary tonic, and the other Roman numeral after the slash is how many scale degrees you're going above that temporary tonic. So for instance, if you have a 5/6/5/5, that represents a 5 of a 5 chord, the temporary tonic here being the 5 of the original key. I hope that makes sense. It can sound kind of confusing, but you'll get used to it. So rules of progression versus retrogression. I think we mentioned last time the difference between progression and retrogression, which is progression is where you go from stable usually to a slightly more tense and unstable before you resolve, whereas retrogression is going from unstable to stable, which is not what you want. So you never want to follow a 5 chord with a 4, a 2/6, or a 2/6/5. You also never want to follow a 6 with a 1, because that is an example of going from unstable to stable, which is bad. For harmonic rhythm, that just means how often you change the root of your chords. There are no specific rules for these. They're established by you, but generally it is recommended that you change the root of chords in quarter notes, half notes. It's really unnecessary to go for eighth notes. They're just quick and extra, if you know what I mean. For melodic scale harmonization, this is a really useful diagram. So for solfege, you can just consider these your scale degrees. These are the chord combinations that you can use to harmonize each scale degree or each solfege note. This is really useful for free response question 7, where they give you the melody and you have to harmonize by writing the bass in based on these. So take a good look at this chart and see what you can learn from it. So the steps to harmonize a melody for free response question 7. First of all, you want to identify the scale degrees of the notes of the melody. Remember how I said they're going to give you the soprano of it? Yeah, you want to take a good look at that, see if you can determine which scale degrees you're going to need to harmonize with. And then you're going to fill in the cadences first, since they make up most of the points for this question. The cadences are very important. Remember, the cadences go where the fermatas are because they mark the end of a phrase. There's going to be 4, but the first one will be filled in for you. You want to make sure to use root position chords for the last 2 chords in each. And remember that cadences can only end with 1, 4, or 5. If you're already not remembering cadences too well, you can go back to 2 videos ago, I believe, where we discussed cadences and which ones there are. Cadences are super prevalent on the exam and they come up everywhere, so of course they're pretty important. Another tip would be to keep it as straightforward as possible. You don't want to invert too much because it complicates things. And you also want to use 7th chords, not a lot of the time. And don't use non-chord tones. They're just unnecessary. And after that, you harmonize everything else, use implied harmonies, connect the dots, sing it in your head, and go through everything to make sure it sounds like a melody from the common practice period. So finally, we have tips to achieve the highest score on the composition FRQs. These are the things that people often lose the most points on. And the reason being that if you miss one of these, it takes away points from other aspects of their grading, which really sucks. There's something called the triangle effect, where, for instance, if you misspell a chord, you not only lose points for the misspelling of the chord, but also more points because that messes up your voice leading into the next chord as well. So if you omit an accidental, you lose 5 points automatically, which is pretty crazy. So you really want to be careful with these. You also do not want to omit the root. Believe it or not, a lot of people mess that up too. And remember to check for parallel fifths and eighths. That is such a big deal. It's very much emphasized, even in the grading guidelines, which, by the way, I highly recommend that you look at because it really shows you where you could possibly get points off. So here's the one for free response question 5. You can take a quick look at these, see what is generally accepted. Note that, for instance, by looking at the grading guidelines, you can see that it doesn't really matter whether you get the case of the Roman numeral correct. I mean, usually we all know that, like, only the major scale degrees are capitalized and the others are not. But here it doesn't matter. They're going to accept it all the same. So don't spend your brain power on that during the test. And take a look at these. Continued. I'm also going to link this in the description because I think it's going to help you quite a bit. So let me just show you the rest of these. So there you go. That'll be all for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you in the next video.